Quick review from last week, which was God judges Judah. And it really shows how a heart of rebellion survives even when things are catastrophic. You know, you would think, that the Israelites that saw Jeremiah's words come true about Babylon coming, you would think that they would have said, oh, we better listen to Jeremiah this time, but they didn't. I was listening to a sermon this morning by Colin Smith, and he was talking about, he's been talking about the Ten Commandments, and he said that people make a God kind of in their own image and what they want. So, and one of the things he said, which was, he said if people want to, accept gay marriage or accept, abortion as moral and good, that maybe they should find another God. And know what happened when the Israelites went to Egypt? They found other gods. They started worshiping the Queen of Heaven. The women started doing that. And they have a faulty remembrance too. They were thinking, oh, it was so good, back, when we were worshiping the Queen of Heaven, and look what happened to us. Well, they didn't get it that the reason they were in captivity is because of, their worshiping of other idols. The same thing happened, remember, when they left Egypt. They were halfway through the desert, after crossing the Red Sea, which should have made a big impression, you would think. And then they said, we want to go back, Who is this Moses guy, He's just trying to be a big shot. Well, so Nebuchadnezzar, when he came, remember he ordered Jeremiah to be well treated, and he was given a choice. He could go back with Babylonians and probably be treated well, get a little condo, and but he decided to stay with the people. For me, I think I would have gone to Babylon.
They didn't treat him very well in Jerusalem. So.
No, right. And then they didn't treat him afterwards very well, right?
It's surprising.
So then this Gedaliah was appointed governor. He seems like a pretty good guy, very, very much trusting though. This Johan came and he said, this guy Ishmael's going to come and kill you, assassinate you. He says, oh no, he's a good guy. And you can be too trusting or not trusting enough. And he was way on the too trusting side. And then of course he was assassinated. So then they thought, well, Gedaliah got killed and a bunch of the soldiers, Babylonian soldiers, so Nebuchadnezzar's going to come and really give it to us. So we better get out of here. We better go to Egypt. But they asked Jeremiah, what should we do? And they said, whatever you say, we'll do. And then Jeremiah came back 10 days later and he says, the Lord says, stay here and I'll take care of you. And they said, we don't believe you, you're lying. And I think they should have left him anyways. Why did they have to take him with? It doesn't make sense either. One of the key phrases was, I thought was, what was that?
Maybe because he just might say something good about it.
Right, yeah. Yeah, he might come around. One of the things when they asked Jeremiah, it was interesting, they said, ask your God. Mm-hmm. And that's pretty significant. They weren't all on board with Jehovah. Well, then when they arrived in Egypt, God gives another message. Their practices were condemned. We talked about the Queen of Heaven. It was a common Mediterranean goddess like the Asherah. Usually a lot of these idols had a lot of sexual component to them. And then, we have to remember that even through all of this, God promised to save. And God is the only hope. And he does show abundant mercy to his people. And then we talked about the traditions of Jeremiah's death. Most probable one is that he was stoned to death in Egypt and buried there. There were some other kind of weirder ones, like that he stopped poisonous snakes in Egypt. He got rid of the crocodiles, and Pharaoh liked him for that. And, but those, there is a reason why some things are apocryphal. So then the last thing we talked about, Baruch is sent and the people disrespect him. That was a flashback to the time of Jeroboam, and he becomes depressed, which, you know what, it'd be easy to do, I mean, here he's bringing God's word and the people are, dissing him, and you're a jerk, Baruch, you're just a toady for Jeremiah. And but Jeremiah talked to him, and God said, admonished him, don't be that way. But I will promise you protection because you've been faithful. Baruch also went down to Egypt as well. Okay, so today the big picture is this focus changes now from Judah's judgment to a chance for redemption to other nations. You remember at the very beginning of the book of Jeremiah, God told him, I have set you over nations, plural, and over kingdoms, plural. And God displays his sovereignty by vowing to judge the nations while still promising to redeem a remnant among them. So, now this isn't unique to Jeremiah, that Isaiah and Ezekiel also had sections of their books where they were going against the other nations that were nearby. And you have that map that shows where some of these nations were. And we're going to talk about them. So the first one we're going to talk about, and one thing that we could say too, that these messages to these other nations and why they're being judged can apply to modern nations today, and including the USA. That if you do these type of things, your judgment is going to come. And as we found out, judgment of God doesn't happen instantaneously. It might be hundreds of years until that judgment finally comes. Remember when the Israelites were in Egypt for 400 years, there's an interesting verse that says the corruption or the sin of the Canaanites was not yet ripe. That God waited. It was actually a time of mercy to see if the Canaanites would come around. And then God did bring judgment on the Canaanites when the Israelites came. Which is a hard thing to understand, but God uses other nations to bring his judgments. So God will judge Egypt in chapter 46. And it becomes very clear at this point why God did not want the remnant to flee to Egypt. They thought they were getting away from Babylon. Well, Babylon came there. So God judges Egypt just like he judges Judah. Nebuchadnezzar now defeats Pharaoh Necho in 605 BC on the banks of the Euphrates. And that's called the Battle of Carchemish. And that's kind of a famous battle in history because at that point, Assyria is kind of wiped off of the memory of the kingdoms. And Egypt has never became a great power again like they were, hundreds of years earlier. And today, Egypt is still not, a great world power. They're still around, but they're not like, oh, what should we, Egypt's going to take over somebody else. They're not going to do that. Now, the judgment came to the land of Egypt not just by the Euphrates though. Now, there was a historian called Herodotus who reports that Necho sent an expedition. That Necho was a pretty bright guy. He actually sent an exhibition to go around Africa in boats. Some of you remember the book Kon-Tiki? Yeah. So he was, a guy that thought sailing was important. He began a construction of a canal that would go from the Nile River to the Red Sea. It was never completed, but that's a pretty big job. He must have had a lot of slave labor to do it. But in 593, though, Necho died, but his son continued to incite Zedekiah, the new ruler of Judah. Now, Necho, remember, is the guy, too, that killed King Josiah. Josiah unwisely went to fight him, and Necho said, I don't want to fight with you. And unfortunately, he got killed in the battle, and Josiah died a fairly young man, and that's when the series of his sons and grandson took over. But he took over. He was kind of a puppet ruler of Judah at that point. And you know what? But when Babylon came to invade Judah and Jerusalem, Egypt provided no assistance. Said, "Sorry, you're on your own." And then Jerusalem finally fell in 587. So Egypt is kind of Israel's old nemesis. Jeremiah poetically describes the defeat. Jeremiah ironically depicts the well-equipped and boastful, highly skilled forces of Egypt and contrasts them with the sequel of an overwhelming defeat and a shameful flight. They did not look back, for fear was all around them. Jeremiah described a full retreat of the Egyptian army before the Babylonians. So it was a shellacking when the Babylonians came to Egypt. And remember, the Israelites were there at the time. And like I said, that's why, God was probably saying, don't go there, that's not safe either. It's the whole idea, the grass is always greener on the other side. It must be nicer over there. Teachers would do things like that too, that, well, if I just go to this other school, they're better, Well, they have the same problems when they went there. So the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, said, I am about to bring punishment on Ammon, the god of Thebes, on Pharaoh, on Egypt, and her gods and her kings, and on those who rely on Pharaoh. I will give them into the hands of those who want to kill them, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, and his officers. Later, however, God says, Egypt will be inhabited as in times past. So once again, that whole thing of there's the judgment, but then said, but there's also my mercy in all of this. Okay. So Egypt is a fitting symbol of how the world lures believers. It must be better in Egypt. It must be better, in another place, to live a different lifestyle. The exiles thought it would be nicer there. Moses had to deal with rebellion of those that wanted to go back to. So the symbolic characteristics of Egypt is worldliness. I remember a guy that I taught with, and then later then he went to another school and I didn't see him for a while. He had 3 teenagers, and he left his wife, and he had grown up in a Christian home, so he knew that wasn't right. And his excuse was, he said, I've always been in a box, and I wanted to know what it was like outside the box. We had a neighbor who was going through divorce and pastored in another church. We got him to counsel them. And he told the dad, the husband, he said, what you're like, he says, because he thought too, this other wife was going to be better. That you're like a garbage truck going down a hill without any brakes. And I can tell you what it's going to be like at the bottom. He didn't listen. And I think Karen knows what I'm talking about on the block. Yeah. And it didn't work out well for anybody. No. So God said, "Do not be afraid, Jacob my servant, for I am with you. Though I completely destroy all the nations among which I scatter you, I will not completely destroy you. I will discipline you, but only in due measure. I will not let you go entirely unpunished." Isn't that interesting? I will discipline you, but only in due measure. God is perfectly just. He's not going to judge us beyond. And that was always one of the hard things about parenting, wasn't it? How much discipline is enough? If you do it too much, well, that's not good either. If you do it too little. But God is the all-knowing Father, and he knows how to discipline us and nations. So Babylon defeats them, but then the Persians in 525 BC do more of a conquest of Egypt. So they're kind of totally wiped out. But God does promise them restoration. And finally, it's interesting, in 1952, Egypt was freed from Great Britain. And it was run by Nasser. Now, Nasser wasn't necessarily a real great guy, but they became kind of a nation, independent nation again in 1952. I remember that. I was 1 year old. Yeah, I remember that. Isaiah 19 promises that, it's interesting, that Egypt, they will be healed and God will bless them and call them his people. That, I don't know when that timeline is right now, but once again, God promises, restoration. And these aren't Israelites. So I don't know if this is talking about the millennium or what. Well, the next part we're going to do, chapter 47, he talks about the Philistines. Well, if you read the Old Testament at all, the Philistines have been a thorn in the side for centuries of the Israelites and have had many conflicts. Now, the term Palestine, which is interesting, comes from the word Philistine. And of course, Palestine is in the news today. And there's still that grudge that's being held. That there's some things that last centuries. Kind of like the McCoys and who were the other ones?
Hatfields.
Hatfields and McCoys, yeah. Well, now, you think back in Bible history during the time of Saul. Okay, there was Goliath and his 4 relatives that were also giants. One with 6 fingers, it said. And they were kind of a race of giants, which is kind of interesting. I don't know, and how big they really were, but so David, of course, killed Goliath. Somebody has said, well, why did he take 5 smooth stones? Didn't he trust that one would do it? And then later on, there's 4 other giants that are killed either by David or by his men. So maybe he was thinking, well, I know there's 4 other guys. If I kill Goliath, these other 4 guys are coming, and I want to have a stone for each of them. That's, speculation, but
makes sense.
Yeah. So David, of course, killed many. Remember the women would dance in the streets when they come back from war. That Saul has killed his hundreds and David has killed his thousands. And that didn't go over real big with Saul.
No.
He kind of had an ego there. And then the Philistines were those that killed Saul and Jonathan. If you remember that story. And then remember when they stole the ark in one of the battles. And then they brought it to their temple of Dagon. And that's such a funny story, you know, where the priests go in there the next morning and Dagon's, you know, face down on the ground. They go, oh, what happened? Somebody came in here and pushed him over or what? So they put him back up. And then the next morning they came in and his arms and I think legs and head were all off the idol in front of the ark. So they thought something was up. So of course they wanted to get rid of it. And first of all, the one city guys said, we're going to send it to this other city. And they said, no, you know, we don't want it. And of course then they got it back. Now the word of the Lord came to Jeremiah the prophet against the Philistines. And it says in verse 1, the reference is to Pharaoh Necho's campaign in 609 BC, which had a twofold purpose: to prop up a tottering Assyrian government against a powerful Babylonia, thus maintaining the balance of power, to extend his own empire in a time of international chaos. So, once again, there's battles going on all the time. And you know, I would think that the wars back then, that was not an easy thing, you know, the supply lines and, you know, if you have, you know, thousands of soldiers, you know, where are they going to get all the food? And, you know, you got to, you know, for the most part, you got to have an army that marches, and there's big distances. But so the Philistines were sea people, and you can see they lived on the coast, and would have been it's interesting, they were called the sea people. Okay.
It's interesting to me how they could make those things in rock, how they make those designs. What did they use to do that? Because they're very distinct, you know, when they're doing or whatever they're doing here.
Yeah.
Can you imagine how much time it took?
Yeah, right. A lot of time for them to do that.
Right. Yeah. Yeah,
They didn't have the internet.
Yeah, they didn't have the internet.
Yeah.
Okay.
No power, didn't have power. Maybe they did, I don't know.
Well, in verse 2 and 3 in chapter 47, it talks about, behold, the waters rise out of the north, and shall be an overflowing flood. They shall overflow the land and all that is in it, the city and those who dwell within. Then the men shall cry, and all the inhabitants of the land shall wail. And the noise of the stamping hoofs of the strong horses, and the rushing of his chariots, and the rumbling of his wheels. The fathers will not look back for their children lacking courage. So Jeremiah is describing the tragedy of the coming Babylonians invasion. And it would bring such a crisis and fear that natural affection and courage would be forgotten. So they wouldn't even go back to help their little sons. They were just fleeing, just trying to get out of there. So God's judgment came to the Philistines. Next, we're going to talk about chapter 48. God will judge Moab. Most of us know the history of Moab and Ammon. They were descendants of Lot. They were the land of Moab and Ammon today is the country of Jordan. And you know, Jordan is a fairly stable Middle Eastern country today. You know, you never hear too much about Jordan being in trouble or Jordan, you know, bombing Israel and things like that. But remember, both these sons were conceived by incest between Lot and his two daughters. And so it wasn't a good start. But they opposed Israel when they were coming back from Egypt. They entered the Promised Land. When they entered the Promised Land, God had prohibited them from entering the sanctuary. So he said, because you stopped you weren't friendly to your relatives, coming back from Egypt, you can't enter the sanctuary. Now, ironically, Ruth was, of course, a Moabite and the great-grandma of David and an ancestor of Christ. She must have suffered, when Ruth came back to Israel, considering the background of how people felt about Moab, she was probably kind of a pariah. They were thinking, boy, Ruth there, she's a good-looking gal, but she's a Moabite. And so for Boaz to take her on as a wife too, that was probably pretty special. Now, another thing that happened, David, when he was being pursued by Saul, he sent his parents to the king of Moab for protection. So there must have been periods where they got along pretty well. And remember, one of the things too that was bad was they were the ones that hired Balaam to curse the Israelites. And remember Balaam is really a strange character, I've always thought. Was he a real prophet? Well, it seems like he maybe was. But remember, they said, well, we'll give you this much. He says, well, I'll think about it, And then he finally said, I can't curse what God has blessed. And, and Balak, the king, said, what? I did all this work to get you here, and that's all you got for me? So there is a lot of history between them and Moab, and you can see on the map there where Moab is. And Jeremiah predicts plundering and great destruction. He says, Moab is destroyed. Her little ones have caused a cry to be heard. And there were a lot of prophets that spoke out against Moab. Amos did, Isaiah did, Ezekiel did. So Jeremiah wasn't unique in his condemnation of Moab. Their biggest problem was they were proud. It says, because you have trusted in your works and your treasures. Moab was a very wealthy nation. They were on trade routes. So they got a lot of, they had a good supply chain. And the treasures and lack of conflicts made them proud. They were very self-reliant, but they were ripe then for God's judgment. Now, one of the reasons they had like desert on one side and mountains on the other, and so a lot of armies wouldn't go in to attack them. So they felt kind of like, not to worry, we're safe. So they felt safer, but God says in verse 11, Moab has been at ease from his youth and has settled on his dregs. He has not been emptied from vessel to vessel, nor has he gone into exile. So his taste remains in him, and his scent is not changed. And that's, of course, an analogy which I'm not real familiar with, winemaking, where when they have them in the pot and then they decant the top part off, leaving the sediment down below, that says that they haven't been poured from vessel to vessel, that they kind of just stuck in their ways. So that's, that can apply to the United States too. We can say, we've been at ease from our youth and we've been settled in, and we think that, we can't be attacked, we're isolated, and
It can apply to us individually.
it can apply to us individually, is right.
Yeah, everybody gets set in their laurels and in the wrong path. God's going to send something along to tip you over and pour you out,
Right.
because your stench
Right.
rises to him in heaven.
Right.
You're going to send a wagon wheel down your rut.
Yeah. Yeah, there's an old saying that the Lord knows the proud from afar off, and that's where he keeps them.
That's where he keeps them.
So the application here is wine improved by being allowed to rest upon its sediment. But contrast the use in Zephaniah, its taste and scent were unimpaired. If emptied from vessel to vessel, it would become vapid without fragrance and tasteless. Something like this was how now to happen to the nation by being taken captive. Or verse 29, it also says, we have heard of the pride of Moab. He is exceedingly proud of his loftiness and arrogance and pride, and of the haughtiness of his heart. Boy, that's kind of says it. And then verse 42, the mighty men's hearts in Moab on that day shall be like the heart of a woman in birth pangs. Some of you remember that. And Moab shall be destroyed as a people, because he exalted himself against the Lord. So, like he mentioned there, they offering his firstborn son. That was a, child sacrifice and human sacrifice has been around for a long time. And you think of just how in the world, you think of the Aztecs too. When the conquistadors came, they were offering sacrifice, and they even took some of the Spaniards and offered them as sacrifice too. But Chemosh was the principal Moabite deity, and sacrificing of children was an important part of this cult. But then, verse 47, there is once again the ray of hope that God always gives. Yet I will bring back the captives of Moab. In the latter days, says the Lord, thus far is the judgment of Moab. And of course today, like we said, the area of Moab, whether those are descendants of Moab, I don't know, but the people of Jordan, that's a fairly prosperous country in the big scheme of things,
I'm always amazed at the language that is in here, and it was just the one line I was thinking, but verse 26, talking about Moab, make him, and this is, declares the Lord, make him drunk, for he's become arrogant toward the Lord. So Moab will wallow in his vomit, and he will also become a laughing stock.
Right.
I mean, there is very, very graphic.
Yeah, right.
But he'd been arrogant.
Yeah. So, now chapter 49, talking about Ammon, and that once again was a Lot's relative. And he had violently seized land that belonged to the Jews. But God promised even then too that he would restore the fortunes of the Ammonites. It's funny how some of these old grudges and everything lasted for centuries. And they maybe didn't even remember why. Well, the Moabites, why? I don't know. We just don't like them. Well, the next one is Edom. Now, Edom, that was Esau. Now, Esau had a long feud, and it caused the Edomites to cherish so bitter an enmity against Judah that they exulted with cruel joy over the capture of Jerusalem by the Chaldeans. It's one thing to hold a grudge. It's another thing to rejoice when somebody goes bad, or good, And hopefully, our hearts are never like that when we have an enemy and something happens to them and say, well, serves them right,
We wouldn't do that, would we?
No, we would never do that. So, and we remember the story of Esau and Jacob. And in the big scheme of things, Jacob was a jerk. And Esau had good reason to hold a grudge. Now it seems like he kind of forgave him, because when Jacob was coming back with his 2 wives and his kids, he met him, and Esau seemed to be pretty conciliatory. Now Jacob, I don't think, trusted him, because Esau said, you come back and live with me. He says, yeah, I will do that. And then he goes the other way. So, Edom did have good reason maybe not to trust Judah, in humanly speaking. remember the verse in Malachi, Jacob I have loved and Esau I have hated. Now that's a hard verse, isn't it? But what was Esau like? The Bible says in Hebrews, he was, he says, we're warned, don't be like Esau. And Esau did not have eternal values. That was his big thing, He sold his birthright, which in that time period, that was a big deal. And then the blessing, he got cheated out of the blessing, but he actually gave up his birthright before that. And Jacob, I loved, what was that?
That verse you mentioned about one I loved, the other one I hated. It's
Yeah.
kind of strong terminology. If you look at the word itself, it means to be loved less.
Mm-hmm.
Not hate in the sense
Right.
we think of
Yeah.
embittered in,
Yeah. And in God's foreknowledge, he knew what Esau was like too.
Yeah.
Now, the capital of Edom was a famous city, Petra, the city of stone. And we're going to see a little video clip of that. But the people of Edom today have been erased from history. We don't hear about them anymore, which is interesting. Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it, that a guy from Edom would become the clan of the Herods were Edomites. Any comment on that? Well, there's a few more here. Other countries, Damascus, he talks about, Syria. Isaiah predicts the total destruction of Damascus. Now, Damascus is a fairly thriving city today, but so that's probably still yet in the future when that will take place. Damascus is also a symbol of pride and therefore will be judged. Kedar, those are nomadic tribes that were destroyed by Babylon. And actually the Babylonian Chronicles confirm this, how they had destroyed these nomadic tribes of Kedar. And then in chapter 50, the fall of Babylon. Now, the reason he gives is what? Chapter 50. Why was Babylon destroyed? Chapter 50 there. What do you see?
Because of their gods.
Because of their gods, their idol worship, yeah. Their cruelty. I mean, when they would take over a place, they showed no mercy. They would rip people up. They had no, compunction about not killing women and children. So, and Babylon, of course, is symbolic today of the apostate church in Revelation. It's the fountainhead of false religion, so it's symbolic of false religion, Babylon. Now, and of course, Babel has been around for a long time. Back in Genesis, the Tower of Babel, when the people were building these ziggurats to try to reach the heaven because they wanted to be like God. And that was just a symbol, again, of a rebellion against God's ways. And we all know what happened then. God said, okay, I'm going to confuse all their languages. And that's when, the people groups kind of got dispersed across the world. Now, Daniel predicts Babylon's fall too in his dream of the statue and the four beasts. They weren't going to last forever. Now, when Babylon did fall, I was going to read real quick of so let's see. So Baal is the ancient title meaning Lord, and it was used for centuries to refer to the assortment of Babylonian gods. By the later years of the Babylonian Empire, when Jeremiah recorded his prophecy, the title Bel was associated almost exclusively with the chief Babylonian god, the god of fertility and weather, also known as Hammad. Marduk was the patron deity of the city of Babylon and was astronomically associated with the king of planets, Jupiter. God pronounced judgment not only on the Babylonians, but also against their false gods. At the height of power, Babylonian Empire had conquered Judah, laid waste to Jerusalem, and leveled the Temple of Solomon. But Babylonians' turn for judgment was coming. God, through Jeremiah, prophesied that an enemy would invade out of the north. At that time, the empire of the Medes and Persians extended from modern-day Turkey to northwest of Babylon, across modern Armenia, down through Iran. The city of Babylon sat on the plains between the Tigris River and east of the Euphrates. Thus, the best way to attack the city was to sweep down from the north, moving swiftly to the plain between the two rivers. The Medo-Persian Empire arched around the northern and eastern frontiers of Babylon, giving the Medes and Persians an ideal invasion route from the north. Cyrus the Great sent his armies south, and after quickly conquering Opis, the Medo-Persians crossed the Tigris and rolled south to the Babylonian city of Zippar. Because the walls of Babylon were considered impenetrable, the Medo-Persians devised a plan to exploit the weakness. The Babylonians had built a series of metal gates underwater, and that this river could flow beneath the river city walls into Babylon, providing fresh water. During that evening of the Babylonian feast, remember that's when Daniel is called in. During the evening of the feast described in Daniel 5, the Medo-Persian troops worked swiftly and efficiently to dam the Euphrates River upstream. Troops diverted the river waters enough that their fellow soldiers could walk in the riverbed with their heads above water. Upon reaching the metal gate, which was no longer submerged, it was easy to cut through the bars and enter the city unopposed. So pretty ingenious, okay? Just dam up the river and, divert it and then just walk underneath the walls rather than trying to go over them or through them. And it says there wasn't even any fighting, that people were so surprised in Babylon that they just gave up.
Mm-hmm.
And
I have a question.
yeah.
Would Babylon stands for the apostate church, false religion? Would that be Islam?
Well, I don't know. People have been a lot of theories about.
Yeah.
Islam is a false religion, whether it's what's going to happen at the end. People have said, Rome is going to be the whore of Babylon, and
A Bible teacher I want to listen to. He's dead now, but he said at one time, he said the greatest threat to Christianity is Islam. And he said that a long time ago, and it kind of seems like it's playing out.
And I think they're growing faster than Christianity, from what I've heard sometimes. Yeah.
That whole conflict between Ishmael and Jacob
Yeah.
will last forever.
Yeah.
Till time ends, so we know it's going to go on for a while.
Right.
The Lord returns and puts it all down.
Right. Yep, we only see faintly through a fog on the end times what's going to happen. What seems very likely is maybe not going to happen. So, now one interesting point about Babylon. Babylon today was said it was going to be just inhabited by hyenas and owls, and it was going to be nothing. It is that the ruins are still there, never been inhabited again. Saddam Hussein thought he was the reincarnation of Nebuchadnezzar, and he was going to rebuild Babylon and then go live there. Guess what? He ended up in a spider hole, and then he didn't make it. So,
He didn't get past the gallows.
yeah. No, and once again, you know, his pride in thinking he was this great world leader. So,
Pride goes before a fall, and how he
Yeah.
stands before destruction.
yeah. But I knew a guy who had been stationed in Iraq, and he said that one day he went and he saw the ruins of Babylon. And basically, I think there's just the big gate that's still there and part of the front wall.
I always think we should look at Damascus, because there's a scripture, I don't remember where it is now, it says, when Damascus is no more, and I forget how it goes, but,
Yeah, well, Jeremiah predicted that Damascus would be destroyed, but it hasn't yet
you
today.
know, it hasn't, so I'm
So
waiting.
that's coming.
I'm waiting.
Yeah.
It's coming.
I think it's Jeremiah 10 something. I don't know.
Okay, well, we'll close in prayer, and we're a little after 11, so. Okay, Heavenly Father, thank you for this time we can spend together. Thank you for your word. Thank you for the accuracy of your word. And just help us now and help us in applying these things to our lives. In Christ's name, amen.